It's the Awesemo NBA DFS strategy show, and a very special show for me because not only do I have the usual Jordan Klein behind the scenes producing, but for the first time ever, I'm on camera with the Awesemo Alex Baker. Alex, we've never done a show together before. I've worked for you for a while now. In terms of the hierarchy of your DFS accomplishments, where does doing a show with me rank?
Well, I'll have to see by the end of the show. Maybe you're gonna make me look pretty bad here. So hopefully, my takes can match yours, and then it will be up there.
Yeah, Alex's DFS resume. It's gonna be like whatever X-time live finals winner and one-time DFS show with Greg Ehrenberg. That's gonna be the resume. Guys, don't forget, subscribe to our podcast network. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like the video. And by the way, the easiest way to get on the good boy list for Christmas coming up is you subscribe to our YouTube channel, because not only is that going to give you access to all the best information as soon as possible, but you get to see Alex and I do more shows together in the future, hopefully. And then also don't forget that if you use the promo code Caruso, you get $1 NBA access through December 29th. That is for all new users of Awesemo.com. And that's going to include our projections, ownership projections, Slack chat, lineup builder, and much more. So that is just $1 to get access to everything using the promo code Caruso. So Alex, let's quickly hit on last night's slate. Just 2 games, first slate of the season. How did it go for you? And what do you think were some of the pitfalls?
I'll just say I'm ready to move on to today's slate. But let's talk about it for a couple of minutes here. I mean, Eric Pascal, he was the guy that got a lot of minutes last year when Draymond Green was out. So he made sense to just kind of plug and play. You can't predict someone just playing terrible and then getting benched. So, I mean, maybe you could with Pascal, but I don't really consider him like a terrible player. But the other thing was some of these rotations were a little bit tougher to predict. Like, Dennis Schroeder was starting. We didn't really know for sure because Kyle Kuzma started a few of the preseason games. And then LeBron James just wasn't playing the same rotation as last year. And there was a point guard starting with him. So there are a lot of moving pieces. Didn't really call them all correctly, so it didn't work out that great. But I saw a couple of people won 500K. Anyway, how did it turn out for you?
Well, at least there was overlay on FanDuel, so that helped me more than if there wasn't overlay on FanDuel. The other thing, too, is I don't know if you saw this, but it came out also that LeBron apparently hurt his ankle during last night's game. So he was a little hobbled. That impacted the amount of minutes he played, and apparently he might not play in the Lakers' next game. But, yeah, I mean, there was a bunch of weirdness. I was also very wrong in predicting the Clippers starting lineup. And then on a 2-game slate, what happens is then you get to the later game. It's like, Nick Batum's starting. I thought that Ivica Zubac was going to start, and then there just isn't that much wiggle room to make pivots when it's a 2-game slate. So, yeah, definitely looking forward to a slate like today where we have lots of options to choose from, and there's probably a dozen Eric Pascals to pick from on this slate. And that is something also I think we should hit on really quick, is how do you approach some of these big slates differently than the small slates? Because I know I go about approaching my lineup builds. It's pretty different on a slate with 13 games versus 2 games.
So today's slate is a little different because we have 13 games. None of them have played this year so far, so we don't have a ton of data. So I feel like today is going to be mostly about kind of like making the right reads on each team. As far as kind of lineup construction, I feel like there's a couple plays that might be close to lock button. And then the rest of the guys are all kind of like going to blend in to the crowd. So it's going to be like mixing and matching all these pieces, putting the puzzle together. What are you making of today's slate so far?
Yeah, so, I mean, the one thing, and this will transition right into the point guard as we talk about with Luka Doncic, is there's no Kristaps Porzingis for the Mavericks. And one thing we saw last year is when KP was off the court, Doncic played just a massive role for the Mavericks. He was somebody who was scoring over 60 fantasy points per 36 minutes. The usage rating was right around 40%. So we opened the season, and one thing that DraftKings did, which we saw them do a little bit at the start of last year also, Doncic is priced way down, and he's much too cheap for a slate without Kristaps Porzingis there. On FanDuel, I think there's a little bit more discussion about his price point. But at least on DraftKings, I look at Luka Doncic as one of the top plays on the slate. And there's a lot of guys we could choose from to pay up for. But I think that Doncic right now is the priority for me. I know in the initial build that I did, he came out as being one of my higher owned players. So that's the first thing that stands out to me with the point guard position. So how do you feel about Doncic? And one thing that also I think we have to consider about him, 40% owned is very substantial for a 13-game slate. So how does that impact how much exposure you want to get to him?
I feel like Luka is probably the easiest kind of guy to plug in your lineup on the slate. I mean, there's Porzingis is out. That kind of solidifies his usage and assists. Not that they're even bad when Porzingis plays, but Luka does it all. He also, you don't have to worry about the minutes. When you're comparing him to some other guys like James Harden, I feel like maybe the conditioning and motivation isn't quite there. So there's question marks there. Then with Giannis, I mean, you have the minutes that last year were never that good. New head coach this year, so we don't know exactly if that's going to change or not. Those three are really the 10K plus options today. So Luka just not having any question marks and being on face value a great play. I think it's just easy to land on him.
Yeah, and the other thing too, and I've talked about this before, something that I like to look at a lot for trying to figure out a fair price for players is looking at some of the historical pricing in similar situations. So if you go back to last year and you look at the price point of Luka Doncic when Kristaps Porzingis was out, he got up to 12,600 on DraftKings. So when you see him opening up this year at 10,000, what's pretty much a similar situation, right? Because the Mavericks didn't make any massive roster changes. Really the big change is that Porzingis isn't there. So we could consider this to be about the same situation it was last year. And to see Doncic priced at 10,000 versus the 12,600 he got up to last year without Porzingis, that just screams value, even though you typically wouldn't think of a 10,000 player as value. Something I think is interesting that you brought up there that I do want to touch on is something like James Harden, because you brought up him as being somebody with some question marks. And I don't usually like to look into narratives that much, but it's kind of hard to ignore some of the stuff going on with James Harden right now. So what do you make of him, not only just this stuff, him going to strip clubs in between games, him potentially being disgruntled with the team, but it's also a totally different teammates that he's playing with. He's got John Wall there. He's got DeMarcus Cousins, Christian Wood. So what do you make of the Rockets situation and James Harden, and how confident are you in wanting to play him in a GPP?
I'd say it's about equal to last year. John Wall kind of and Russell Westbrook have a similar style of play. I mean, just really ball dominant point guards. So James Harden, I think you could expect to have a similar stats to last year. And I guess you're throwing in Christian Wood, who's a little bit of a above average usage guy. That's replacing someone like Daniel House that really didn't take many shots. So just a slight downgrade there. So I think Harden, it's a little tough because I really am scared by those photos that came out, like that first preseason game, because like, man, he looked like really terrible. I don't know if they were like photoshopped or I don't think they were, but that's enough to maybe like wait and see one game. Although he did average 24 minutes in the preseason, which is pretty high for a star. But the rumors about like, I mean, it's I guess it's not a rumor that he wants to be traded and that he's like been a really like destructive teammate and stuff. I mean, just a lot of bad juju surrounding him. But maybe that's like narratives. It's like so hard to like actually like predict what's going to happen because maybe he'll be extra motivated to try to like convince other teams to buy into him.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I always think is funny about narratives is so much of them could go either way, and then you kind of write whatever the story is after the fact. So one thing I actually feel about Harden is certainly in cash games, I'm way more confident in Luka Doncic, and it's a little different comparing FanDuel to DraftKings because they have different positional eligibility. But at least on DraftKings, they're around the same price. They both have point guard eligibility. And you look at Luka Doncic, 10,000, James Harden, 10,400. And something that we talk about a lot at Awesemo is odds of success and maybe the odds of somebody ending up in the optimal lineup, not necessarily just the projection itself or who we think is going to do well. So one thing I look at when we compare Luka Doncic to Harden right now is that Luka has 40% ownership and Harden has 5% on DK. So just looking at those numbers, I don't necessarily think that Luka's 10x more likely to end up in the optimal lineup than James Harden. So for that reason, at least in GPPs, I think Harden's a really good pivot play because both of the concerns that we have about him are very legitimate, right? Who knows what he's going to look like? There could be, for all we know, he could miss a shot and throw a ball at John Wall's head, and he'll just be like, screw these guys, I don't want to be here. But everybody has that in their mind, and that's why we're seeing this really depressed ownership on James Harden. So in a weird way, I think you could almost make the case that these concerns make him a better GPP play just because the ownership is so low.
Well, it really depends on the lineup, I'd say, because like you can't just yeah, like if you take Luka and Harden, like the kind of lineups they would fare well in would be very different lineups. Like Luka being the most popular player of the slate, you need to fill a lineup around him that has some more edgy options that are lower owned. Where Harden, if you pair him with those guys, your lineup just won't be high enough projected to really stand a good chance. So with Harden, you'd kind of plug him in with some of the best value plays where Luka, you'd have to build around with some contrarian options.
So talking about some of those value plays, then at least on DraftKings, one guy that stands out to me at the point guard position is Killian Hayes, and that's somebody who ended up coming up in a lot of my lineups. And it's always a little hard to figure out what rookies are going to look like to open the season. Like, I mean, James Wiseman last night, who basically didn't do all that much for the first three quarters, then in garbage time just ends up crushing against the backups. But we look at Killian Hayes as somebody who, if you look at that Pistons lineup, it's hard to figure out where the usage is going to go, where the minutes are going to go, because it's a very bad roster. And Killian Hayes is a guy who they drafted highly in the draft, somebody who they really want to get minutes and build their team around. So at the very least, the opportunity's there for Killian Hayes. I don't necessarily know if the performance is going to be there, but I don't really think that's knowable right now because we've never seen him in an NBA game. But for the price point, how do you think of him as a value play, just given the opportunity it looks like he's going to have?
Yeah, I think Killian Hayes is one of the best value plays on the slate. I mean, everyone's been talking about his odds to win Rookie of the Year being among the highest of the rookies, even though his draft slot was seventh, I believe. So not the highest draft pick, but opportunity is really the driving factor in that Rookie of the Year race. And with Reggie Jackson shipped off this year, really it's Killian Hayes' job to lose. You got Derrick Rose as the sixth man essentially. So I don't think Killian Hayes is going to like play insane minutes, but all the buzz around him has been that he's already making a big impact in Detroit. And we do have a little bit of data. So what I look at is these preseason stats: 23% usage, 23% assist rate. That kind of indicates to me that he's going to be around a point a minute guy, which at 3,900, I mean, that's great value.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why also when I ran just dummy builds before we were doing the show, he ended up being one of my higher owned players. And then that also enables you to get to some guys like Luka Doncic pretty comfortably. Even without much information, I think that Killian Hayes is a pretty safe cash game play just based on the price. And then, like you said, also the other thing with some of these rookies, when they're just going to be on the court for 30 plus minutes and the price is this cheap to open, it's hard for a point guard to really just totally bomb given the amount of time they have the ball in their hands. I think the two safest positions usually for production are going to be point guard and center, just because centers are going to pick up a lot of rebounds and point guard just have the ball in their hands. They're either going to end up taking shots because the ball is there, or they pass to somebody and that person just happens to make a shot so they get assists. So Killian Hayes, definitely somebody who I like a lot. Are there any other value plays that are really standing out to you at the point guard position?
Well, George Hill, maybe a guy to look at. I don't think he's like a very great fantasy player, but he was a key piece in Milwaukee last year. Now you plug him into this Oklahoma City team that traded Chris Paul. I mean, George Hill isn't any sort of replacement for Chris Paul, but there should be good opportunities. SGA is kind of the focal point of this offense, but George Hill, he has solid overall stats. And one thing that really impressed me was last year, he had a 66% true shooting percentage, which is just like incredibly high. So I think that he's actually a little bit underrated, and he's 3,600. So he's really the cheapest guy that you could go to. What do you think about George Hill? I mean, I don't love the name, but the position or the opportunity looks not bad.
Yeah, I ended up getting a decent amount of exposure to him in my initial dummy build I made, and it's for the reasons you said. I mean, you look at the Thunder roster, and it's very hard to figure out just where the minutes going because they do not have very good players on the team overall, and there's a big void to fill with Chris Paul gone. And then also, I mean, we've got Steven Adams is gone. There's just a whole host of players who they shipped out, Danilo Gallinari. And it's a team that has really transitioned to. I kind of think that they originally built their team last year thinking it was going to be a tank type year, and and they ended up being good and making the playoffs. And they're like, we're not having any of that this year. We're getting rid of everybody and just bare bones. We're rebuilding. That opens up a lot of DFS opportunity. And somebody you mentioned there that I think transitions really well to us talking about the shooting guard position is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is one of my favorite overall plays on this slate. And a little backstory on me trying to project SGA as we went into the season. As I was figuring out my best ball rankings, I had SGA coming up so high that I had to nerf it because I was like, I can't have him being like a top 6 player going into best ball drafts because I'll just take him way too early in all my leagues. But with that said, like you just look at this Thunder roster and he might lead them in every single category. He might lead them in points. Might lead them in assists, rebounds, steals, blocks, because he's that good of a player and they're so devoid of talent elsewhere that if he's going to be somebody who plays, 38, 40 minutes or something like that per game, then I just think the counting stats for him are going to be ridiculous. So the price point for him, even if it's more expensive than what we saw from him last year, he's going to be one of my highest owned players tonight because there's just so much opportunity in that Oklahoma City roster.
Definitely. Yeah. I think the situation this year with no Chris Paul is going to really change his role on the team. Last year, SGA was kind of the backup point guard in addition to the starting shooting guard. So we have good amount of data without Chris Paul on the court. When Chris Paul was off the court, he averaged a 25% assist percentage. And then I'm using NBA Wowie for this, so that's a nice little tool. When Chris Paul was on the court, his assist percentage was 11%. So he got more than double the number of assists when Chris Paul was off the court. A large part of what I'm going to be doing today is trying to figure out the best estimates for these kind of rates to plug in. But assuming this kind of bump in usage and assists, SGA at 7,500 on DraftKings and 8,100 on FanDuel looks like he could absolutely crush.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's also another point, too, is there are some of these numbers that just look so absurd when you look at these guys with players off the court. And it was the same thing I had with like Steph Curry yesterday, where it's like we didn't have much information on Steph Curry last year. We go back to 2 years ago, his numbers without Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant on the court. And it's like, well, these numbers aren't sustainable, but they also all point towards him being a ridiculous play. And then you look at the outcome of last game where he ends up scoring like 45 fantasy points without even playing much of the second half. And you start to think like, what kind of a fantasy season is Steph Curry going to have this year? And that's something I kind of feel with SGA also, where just all the shots are going to be going to him because you look at the roster. And I mean, we mentioned George Hill before as a decent play because there is nobody else on this team to shoot. So SGA is definitely going to be a core play for me, somebody who I want to get a lot of exposure to. And that's also one of the reasons that we like somebody like George Hill. Some of the other shooting guard options that stand out to me a little bit, Zach LaVine is a player who I think the Bulls this year are not going to be very good, but it's kind of an experimental year for them also. Like they're starting Kobe White at point guard, and that could take some shots away from Zach LaVine. But still, if we look at LaVine, he's much cheaper right now than he was to finish last year, where he finished the year really strong. And he was a guy who was priced around 9,000, and he's priced way down from that to start the year now. So I think there's a little bit of value in him. I think he's a good pay up option. Do you have any takes on Zach LaVine?
Yeah, I think LaVine's a good option. Atlanta, you got to project them to be one of the worst defensive teams in the league. So that matchup is good. I mean, I'm kind of going off just like the age of the team. Clint Capella is out tonight as well. So that's one kind of good player that Atlanta's going to be without. And it looks like Chicago is there as close to a pick 'em. Looks like Chicago is a 2-point underdog, so very competitive game. They're giving Chicago some decent credit there. A lot of it is because of Zach LaVine. The situation doesn't look tremendously different from last year with Markkanen, Wendell Carter. Kobe White is in, but their starting point guard last year, I can't even remember offhand who it was, but not like a big difference maker. And then the other difference is Patrick Williams is starting. Otto Porter is coming off the bench most likely. So pretty much the same situation. So we're looking at our priors, and that was Zach LaVine just being a more expensive player.
And then one other player at the shooting guard position I ended up getting a good amount of exposure to, at least on FanDuel, not on DraftKings, but is Bradley Beal. And that's somebody else who I find it pretty hard to peg down with Beal, because we have Russell Westbrook there. And I mean, if we look at Beal from last year, one thing that really led to him having a lot of success is the ball was in his hands constantly. He was somebody who was the primary facilitator. He also led the team in usage by a pretty wide margin. And now we have Russell Westbrook in the mix. And one thing, though, that doesn't deter me too much is just another guy who just difference in price. We have Bradley Beal opening the season at 8,100 on FanDuel. He closed last season priced at over 10,000. So that's where it's a little bit of a struggle for me, because it does make sense to think that he's going to have a step back in usage based on Russell Westbrook being there. But still, the price has gone down so much on FanDuel to offset that. Do you still think that he makes for a good play on FanDuel as I do? Because it's hard for me to weigh the difference between a decrease in usage and a decrease in salary.
Yeah, he stands out as a great play on FanDuel. Just a good price tag. As you're saying, the usage and ball handling should go down with Westbrook, but I mean, the price went way down, so it kind of accounts for that. Matchup versus Philadelphia, not the most exciting, but I think that the price for Beal on FanDuel is pretty solid.
And then one final value play I wanted to hit on shooting guard, who's somebody that I have interest in, is Alec Burks. And here's the reason why. It looks like he's going to start at shooting guard for the Knicks this year. Burks has been a high usage guy in the past, and we've seen him in some of these situations with bad teams where he starts, most notably with the Warriors last year, where he was a pretty good fantasy producer, ended up being a guy who was averaging like high 20 fantasy points per game as a starter for the Warriors. And now he's opening the season relatively cheap for the Knicks, probably going to be starting, playing a significant role, a guy who's not afraid to shoot. The other thing, too, that we've seen in the past with Tom Thibodeau is he runs his starters out on the court forever. If somebody's starting for Tom Thibodeau, he will run them into the ground. So Alec Burks, maybe not somebody points per dollar who's like a top play on the slate, but as a contrarian play, I think he makes for a good option just based on what we've seen from Thibodeau and what we've seen from Alec Burks while he's been a starter in the past. So what do you think of Burks, and are there any other cheaper starting shooting guard options that you think make sense on this slate?
Yeah, Burks is in a nice spot in New York. He was pretty successful off the bench as far as a fantasy option in Philadelphia. So then you just plug him into this team that really is a lot lower in talent, and you got to think that they're going to need someone that can fill up the buckets, even if he's not that great a player. That guy certainly could be Burks. So I think just looking at their depth, it looks like some of their depth options at shooting guard are out. I mean, Austin Rivers is kind of a point guard / shooting guard. He's out. And then it's kind of hard to call this rotation, I'd say. Emmanuel quickly is the new point guard that they drafted. I assume he's going to step into the backup point guard for Elf Payton. And then you got Reggie Bullock. He's a solid defender, 3-and-D guy. Not exactly the best fit for the Knicks. So I feel like the only thing that's making me question this is RJ Barrett and Elfrid Payton and Alec Burks all together might be a pretty small starting backcourt. So what do you think of the fit there?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. Number one, I don't think there's any a combination of players the Knicks could put out that fits well for a couple of reasons. It's number one, they just don't have very good players on the team. And then number two, they've built the team through both free agency and the draft where they just have a bunch of guys that play the same position. So they drafted Obi Toppin this year, who's a prospect who there's a couple reasons I don't really like him all that much. I think he's a good offensive player, but he had a very poor track record of being a defender in college. And then the other thing also, he's going to be 23 years old this year. The track record of guys coming into the NBA at that advanced of an age, it's very poor. It's basically none of them have ever hit. So just looking at that, it's hard for me to think that somebody at that age is going to step in and be good. I just can't assume that he's going to be the guy. It's like the Knicks who, as if they have some great track record of drafting players as is. It's like, oh, they found the one guy who they drafted at 22 years old that's going to be a difference maker in recent years. So then you look at the Knicks team also, Julius Randle's there. I like Mitchell Robinson as a defensive player. The Knicks don't seem to like Mitchell Robinson. They're going to start Nerlens Noel at center. So there's just so many players there that I just don't think really make sense and don't necessarily fit together well. So to answer your question, the short way is no, it's not going to fit, but it's because no matter who they put out on the court, it's not going to fit anyway. But Alec Burks, at the very least, is a guy who I know is going to shoot the ball when he touches it. And just given what we've seen about from Thibodeau in the past, where he likes to run his starters out for, upwards of 40 minutes most games, we've always seen him somebody who is not afraid to just leave the starters out on the court for most of the game. That's kind of what has me gravitating towards Alec Burks a little bit. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that it's all going to be about the minutes. If Alec Burks gets 30 plus minutes, he's going to absolutely destroy his salary. There's not a lot of data to have any sort of basis for predicting that. So I guess we could look at last year's rotations, even though they're different players,
and a different coach.
Yeah, it's going to be all about kind of figuring out this stuff with limited data. So I think he definitely has that potential to be a great player.
And then any other shooting guard options that have really stand out to you, or any guys that you really are looking like you might get an appreciable amount of ownership to?
It looks like a pretty weak position, to be honest. Eric Bledsoe is popping up for me. So let's I'm looking at this New Orleans roster where he is kind of he came in and Drew Holiday got shipped out. Otherwise, I guess you have Steven Adams as center. So that's a change as well. But Eric Bledsoe is a good player. I feel like he didn't play quite as much last year because he had a good backup in George Hill, and the Bucks really didn't run anyone out for big minutes. Now, Drew Holiday averaged 35 minutes a game last year, so Eric Bledsoe could be in line for 30 plus. And what I'm going to look at here, sometimes you can make deductions from where the dollars are going on how the team's going to play, because obviously the coaches want to make everyone look good for who everyone paid. And the two highest paid players on the Pelicans right now are Steven Adams, $27 million a year, and then Eric Bledsoe at $17 million. So I feel like they're paying him huge money, and they have this incentive to try to make the best of it. So what do you think of Bledsoe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point there. The one thing that I also think could play in Bledsoe's favor that doesn't really get reflected in his stats from last year is we look at what Budenholzer's always done in Milwaukee and other places he's coached. He does not give his starters very many minutes. So the one drawback has always been to rostering Giannis Antetokounmpo is, yes, he's by far the best permanent fantasy producer in the league, except there are times where Budenholzer will only play him, 27, 28 minutes a game to a fault. Even in the playoffs, he didn't extend the minutes of his starters all that much. Now we see Eric Bledsoe in a new situation. So he goes from playing in Milwaukee to now playing in a team like New Orleans, where for all we know, those, 27 minutes per game he played last year, he could end up playing over 30 minutes per game because it's a new situation. Now, we don't know that for sure, but one thing we do know is that he's priced for his time and the minutes he played while he was in Milwaukee and his production last year. And it seems to me that there's more upside in his minutes than downside. To your point, he is one of the higher paid players on the team. Maybe that has some influence. But the other thing also is that his minutes were so close to the floor last year. There's no way he's going to start and play 24 minutes per game or anything like that. So to me, the minutes can only go up. He's generally priced for his production from last year. So if we do see those extra minutes, which I think is fairly likely, then it's going to be extra production too, because obviously the more time he's on the court, the more time he has to produce. So I think that's probably the angle I look at it from. How confident are you in Eric Bledsoe's minutes, and how much do you think he'll play? Do you think he'll be a guy who gets over 30 minutes per game?
So when I'm looking at this team's preseason numbers, it actually tells a really interesting story because they ran out the starters for full minutes. Bledsoe averaged 33 minutes over their preseason games. I'm not sure if he played one or two, but that kind of tells it all. Most teams aren't even running their players out for more than 25. So if he played 33 minutes in preseason, I feel pretty confident he'll get 30 plus in the regular season. And then you also look at Zion Williamson. He got 34 minutes a game in the preseason, so that bodes well for him. And Ball got 33. So I feel like this rotation may be one of the easier ones to feel confident in.
Yeah, and then, to that point also, if Eric Bledsoe was playing under 30 minutes per game last year, he's playing over 30 minutes per game this year in the preseason, it's not like they're all of a sudden going to be like, oh, well, we're playing him less minutes in the regular season than we did the preseason. So I think that's all salient points and good reasons to think that Eric Bledsoe is probably a little bit underpriced opening the season. So now moving over to the small forward position, I think this is one of the harder positions to fill, particularly on DraftKings, because they have shifted Giannis from small forward eligibility to power forward this year on DraftKings. So if we look at the small forward position, there are not very many strong options. And the ownership kind of reflects that too. I mean, if you look at the ownership on these guys, there's only a few guys that are projected for over 10% ownership. The most popular being Jaylen Brown at 16%. Then there's Tobias Harris at 14%. And then you just have a bunch of guys who are sub 10% at the position. So who at this position do you think actually does make for the strongest play? Because there's nobody I look at here that I'm like, oh, this is the small forward I feel great about.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, I think Patrick Williams is kind of like the chalk guy, and I think it might be bad chalk. He's the new starting small forward in Chicago, and I'm looking at his stats. I mean, he's only 3K, so like he really opens up the rest of your lineup. But in the preseason, he had a 19% usage rate. That's the good news. His assist percentage was 2.6%, and his rebounding rate was 5%. So this is screaming to me a guy that just is going to have low per minute stats. But he opens up so much at 3K, like that's just way too low. So what are you making of Patrick Williams?
Yeah, and actually I made a mistake there because I looked over him. I had him written down as a power forward. But yeah, small forward and power forward eligibility. It's kind of interesting because I agree with your point there that I'm not sure how productive he's going to be. But at the same time, too, it's such a difficult position to fill tonight, and he's min-priced. So if he's going to start and play, say 26, 27 minutes, somewhere around there, I think that's a fair estimate. I don't necessarily think he has to score, 25 fantasy points to be a great play just because there are no good plays at the position. So looking at it from just an opportunity cost perspective, what are you missing out on by rostering Patrick Williams? Because I'm not sure that there's some other guy at the position that really stands out to me. And then he kind of opens up some of the salary elsewhere. The biggest concern I really have here, though, is that he's going to be so popular.
Yeah, I mean, there's some decent plays. One that I'm kind of landing on is DeMar DeRozan. Obviously, a really solid fantasy contributor. Derek White is out this game. I mean, that doesn't make a ton of difference, but it does mean that you probably have Lonnie Walker starting instead of Derek White, so that's more assist opportunities for DeRozan. He's just really cheap at 7,300. And let me pull up how many points he averaged last year, because I feel it's quite a bit more than 5x. But the matchup is really good too versus Memphis. Memphis is one of the faster paced teams with this new Ja Morant offense. At least they were last year. So I think that there should be a lot of possessions in this game. And let's see, DeRozan averaged 39 points per game last year. I see no reason why that would go down. That's already a good deal above 5x. So do you have any reasons to not like DeRozan today? Because just looking at his average performance compared to salary, he looks pretty good.
So the only concern I have with the Spurs as a whole is going to be the spacing in their offense. And now that Derek White isn't there, we're going to see a lot of lineups with DeJounte Murray and DeMar DeRozan together, and LaMarcus Aldridge for that. And none of the three of them can shoot at all. Like DeMar DeRozan, off the top of my head, I think he, for a wing, he made it was like 0.2 threes per game last year. So that's the real concern I have there is what's the spacing going to look like in the offense? Because one thing about Derek White is it does open up extra usage with him out for DeMar DeRozan. But I do worry a little bit, what does the offense look like? And is it just going to be really, really bad from a spacing perspective? But even so, I think that DeMar DeRozan at his price point at 7,300 is viable. One guy that's a little bit cheaper that I think I like a little bit more, and I'm interested to hear what you think about him, is Tobias Harris. Because talking about good matchups, he's going up against the Wizards. They were a terrible defense last year, and especially for fantasy purposes, because not only were they near the bottom of the league in defensive efficiency, but they also played at a really fast pace. And I think that pace, you can make a case, is going to be even higher now that Russell Westbrook is their point guard, because he's somebody who really pushes the pace a lot. The other thing to consider, too, with the 76ers is I like the moves they made a lot in the offseason. they traded away guys like Al Horford and Josh Richardson, who, even though they are good players, they added extra three-point shooting into their team. So I think adding somebody like Seth Curry, who maybe isn't just a better player in terms of just value individually to somebody like Al Horford, I think he's a much better fit in the Sixers offense. And I think it's going to help all those guys that they have extra spacing. So Tobias Harris at 6,200, he's actually the guy who I have the most exposure to at small forward right now on DraftKings.
Yeah, I like that. I think that you take out Al Horford and Josh Richardson, and you're replacing them with Danny Green and Seth Curry, two very, below average usage players, especially compared to Horford and Richardson. That just means more shots are going to go to Harris, Simmons, and Embiid. So at 6,200, and the fact that Tobias Harris is someone that they run for close to 35 minutes a game, that's someone I can buy into.
And then one other guy here who interested me a little bit is Bojan Bogdanovic. The reason being, going up against the Portland Trailblazers, he's been priced down a lot from last year. Portland was bottom 5 in the league in defensive efficiency last year. The Jazz have basically returned the same exact team this year that they had last year. And Bogdanovic is a little bit out of sight, out of mind, because last year he had, I think it was like a torn ligament in his wrist, so ended up having surgery, didn't play in the playoffs, didn't play in the bubble. But if you look at his production before he got hurt, he was very consistently a guy that was priced around 6,000. He spent almost the entire half of the season priced from 5,900 to 6,300. So the fact that he's opening up the season priced at 5,100 on DraftKings in a plus matchup against Portland, that's a little bit of a misprice to me. So that's somebody else who in the mid-range I think makes for a pretty decent value play.
Definitely, I like it. He really surprised last year with his 25% usage rate. They definitely ran the offense a lot through him, which was a big surprise. And doing, Royce O'Neal is going to be starting for the Utah, and that just opens up a lot of shots for Conley, Mitchell, and Bogdanovic because he doesn't shoot.
And then any other small forwards that stand out to you here? I think a lot of guys here are fair plays. Patrick Williams being the cheap guy, I think a lot of DFS players will get to, but other than that, I don't think this is a great position to pay up for, just because there isn't, a Giannis or a Jason. There is Jason Tatum here, but not somebody who I put in the same category as like Giannis or Luka or any of those guys.
I'll give some honorable mentions here because, there's so many players in the slate. We can't talk about them all in depth, but Dylan Brooks versus the Spurs, he's 5,400, and this was just a question of the minutes. If he plays 30 plus, he's going to be a good value. If he doesn't, maybe not. And then Jeremy Grant, I think, on Detroit, he should be one of the key contributors. Not a great fantasy player, but I think that the minutes should be very good for the price of 4,700. And then Rudy Gay, he's probably getting the start in he's not. I'm confusing myself real quick because if we go, so in the preseason, they started Gay at power forward and LaMarcus at center, I believe. So if he does start and he averaged 25 minutes a game in preseason, he has a decent price tag, but not a key piece for the Spurs, so I don't feel great about it.
Yeah, and then one thing also on Jeremy Grant, which I just think is kind of funny, is when they were talking about the team in the preseason, and they paid Jeremy Grant a significant amount of money in the offseason. So to your point before, where you look at who are some guys that teams are have recently paid or recently traded for that have big salary, they just signed Jeremy Grant to, I think it was a 4-year, $64 million deal. So when you consider they just gave Jeremy Grant that kind of contract, you have to think he's going to play a big role. And I think they maybe aren't evaluating Jeremy Grant properly as a player, just because Dwayne Casey, when he was talking about the other day, what things went right and wrong for the team in the preseason, and he was like, we have to get Jeremy Grant better looks because he's one of the best shooters in the NBA. And I'm like, whoa, who's this player they think they signed? But more importantly, that says to me that they're really planning on making this guy a focal point of their offense. We talked about why we like Killian Hayes earlier in the show, and part of the reason is just that this is a Pistons team that's so devoid of talent that we just have to figure that somebody's going to be getting minutes and shots for them. And that's kind of where Jeremy Grant falls in. It seems like the way that they paid him all that money and the way they're evaluating him, he's going to play a pretty big role for them. So that does make a whole lot of sense to me as a guy in kind of that mid-range, as a guy who has potential to be value. So moving over to the power forward position now, but one thing before we get over there, guys, do us a favor, thumbs up on the video, like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because Alex told me before the show, he said, Greg, what's very important about this show is if we don't get a certain number of YouTube subscribers, I will never do another show with you again. So for my own pride, guys, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's very important. This is what really keeps us going. So do that. And then also check out that promo code Caruso, $1 access to Awesemo.com for all new users for the first week of the regular season. Get access to our projections, ownership projections, all the stuff that Alex and I are using to make decisions and informing some of the stuff we're talking about on this show. So getting over to the power forward position now, I think, yeah, go ahead.
I got a quick note from News God. He DM'd me. He says that James Harden might not play tonight because there was a video of him at a strip club violating COVID protocols. So that will be huge news. We'll have to keep an eye on.
Wow, and very out of character too. I mean, if what's funny about that news is if you were to tell me that story and not give me the name of the player, you just said, "Here's the story. Which player is it?" I think 99% of us are guessing James Harden. Maybe a couple people throw out Lou Williams because it's already happened to him. But yeah, you could just put the name to that story without knowing the name. So yeah, that would obviously be substantial. Let's talk about that for a quick second before moving to power forward position, because if James Harden's out, the one thing that I think would immediately stand out to me is John Wall then would be in position to take a ridiculous amount of usage in that Houston offense. Because, I mean, you think about James Harden, what happened when he was off the court last year and the role that Russell Westbrook played. Then you get in a spot where John Wall would have to play a massive role. Eric Gordon, who's expected to come off the bench, he would probably move into the starting lineup and would become a really viable option. We've seen Eric Gordon play well in the past when James Harden's been out and he started. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. So what do you make of James Harden potentially being out?
Yeah, I think Wall would be great. I mean, coming off this whole year where he didn't play, like, it'll be interesting to see where he's at. But from everything I've heard, everyone's been talking about how good he's looked in preseason. So there are encouraging signs that he would be able to smash his salary at $7,400 if Harden doesn't play. The other guy I'm really intrigued on this team is a power forward, so it kind of segues into our next segment here. Christian Wood. He got a good contract this year, about $40 million for 3 years, and he's a very productive fantasy player. Gets a ton of rebounds and has high usage. I feel like he's kind of like the stretch five that fits in the Rockets system. And it's sad to see PJ Tucker maybe like playing less of the big man role for the Rockets. But I'm just kind of not sure how the minutes are going to work out here because you got DeMarcus Cousins at center for the Rockets as well. I mean, that guy is insanely talented when he's healthy, but he hasn't been healthy. So how are you projecting these two new guys in the Rockets, Wood and Cousins, to fit in here?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be very informed by whatever the starting lineup ends up being. And then obviously also if James Harden's out also, I kind of feel that DeMarcus Cousins isn't going to play that big of a role for them, even though he played well in the preseason. Like talking about the point you made earlier about contracts, right? DeMarcus Cousins on a veteran minimum 1-year contract. Christian Wood, they made a very significant investment and they signed him to like a 4-year, $75 million contract. So you just look at the difference in contracts they gave to those two players. And I have to think that Christian Wood is the player that they're going to prioritize in the offense in terms of starting and also giving bigger minutes to. But with that said, they're probably both viable anyway if James Harden doesn't end up playing. But Christian Wood is going to be my preference. He's somebody else who I have a decent amount of exposure to in best ball. I think that people really overreacted to some decent early games from DeMarcus Cousins and then maybe overreacted to Christian Wood missing a preseason game with a sore elbow. Because when Christian Wood did get on the court for the Rockets, he was ridiculous. He had something like 27 points and 10 rebounds in limited minutes in the one preseason game that he played for them. So he looked great in the preseason also. So I think that Christian Wood is in line for a big season. And I'm not too concerned about DeMarcus Cousins because like we said, if they sign, a 1-year, $4.5 million deal or whatever it is, I don't think they're looking at DeMarcus Cousins as the guy who's the future for the team.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So apparently Wood is center only. So thanks, John, in the chat for that. So I got ahead of the schedule here a little bit. Bad guys. Yeah, Christian Wood. it'll be really interesting to see how he fits in here. In this preseason, he had a 38% usage rate. That was higher than Harden. So I don't expect that, but this is an encouraging sign that he won't just be relegated to a unimportant piece of the offense. So at power forward, I'm kind of I was listening to the slate starter with Ryan and Eric, and they were talking about Lauri Markkanen and how the Bulls didn't extend him a new contract. But man, the prices on the Bulls are insane. He's 4,800 on DraftKings. So I'm trying to reconcile these two things. I think he's still a good play, but maybe you can talk me off of Lauri Markkanen, or are you on him?
So I have bad news for you, because I'm not going to be able to talk you off of Lauri Markkanen because he's been a guy who's been a good fantasy producer in the past when he's been on the court. So let's talk about some of the positives first. Is Markkanen had a very strong rookie season from a fantasy perspective. Last year, he was not nearly as good, but with that said, he's been priced way down. So even though last year was overall a disappointing year for Markkanen where he was injured, like I said, I like to use historical pricing as a baseline for kind of what to expect in terms of production for players. So last year, Markkanen on DraftKings spent most of the season priced right around 6,000, despite his struggles. And if you go back to his rookie year, he was a guy who was priced as high as 8,000. So, I mean, the pricing is just wrong. And I understand that there's concerns here. The team does not seem to be bought into him for the future. They drafted Patrick Williams, who could play the same position as Markkanen. But if I just look at that historical price for him, he's so much cheaper than he typically is at 4,800. And it's a plus matchup. The Hawks have one of the worst defenses in the league last year. And if you look at some people's projections, like Kevin Pelton, he projected them to be the worst defensive team in the league this season. So with that considered, then the other thing also, Clint Capella, to your point, he's going to be out tonight, who's maybe one of the only decent defensive players in that starting lineup. So all that considered, it's a good matchup for Markkanen. And the price is right. So I can't talk you off of him. I'm going to be on him as well.
Nice. I'm glad that we're both on the same page, ride or die, tonight with Markkanen. Who else is standing out at power forward for you here?
So Al Horford, who's power forward and center eligible on DraftKings. And once again, we have to talk about that Thunder team and how there's just no talent there. There's nobody to take shots. So Al Horford's somebody who stands out. And the other thing, too, is with Al Horford, I think there's a lot of talk about him being washed and how bad he looked in Philadelphia last year. But I think a lot of it was circumstantial, because I think the fit with him playing alongside Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid was so bad that he just didn't have the space to operate and really be successful. But if you go look at his numbers last year, when Simmons and Embiid were off the court, I have them right here in front of me, per 36 minutes, 16 points, 9.1 rebounds, 6.7 assists, over a steal and a block per 36 minutes. So you look at those numbers, and he still played well when Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid were off the court. So I think that now that he's away from those guys and in a situation where he has a better chance to have usage, to have the ball in his hands, more space to operate, because he's not playing with guys who are like Simmons and Embiid that are ball dominant and maybe not the greatest 3-point shooters. So the floor is really condensed. I think that Al Horford could have a really big fantasy year. And I think people aren't really on him in a big enough way just because he looks so washed last year.
Definitely. I like Horford a lot. I think for him, it's all about fit. He just doesn't mesh with Embiid. So now that he's on this team that really doesn't have any centers that have any skills, I'm really intrigued that he's this may be one of the worst rebounding teams on paper in the league. I feel like he's going to have to rebound the ball a lot more. And for context, in the preseason, last year, his defensive rebounding rate was 17%. In the preseason, a limited sample, but he was 27%. If he can increase those rebounds, he's already a guy that gets assists, has a reasonable usage rate, but not above average. But I feel like, man, he could kind of be that guy that fills up the stat sheet in every category, unexpectedly.
And maybe even expectedly to us, because I mean, yeah. I look at those numbers he had when Simmons and Embiid were off the court last year, and they're so strong. And then you look at this Thunder roster also, and to me, it's like SGA is going to do a lot, Al Horford's going to be a lot. There's a reason we're talking about George Hill as a play, and it's not because we think George Hill is some great fantasy producer, great player. It's because there's nobody to take minutes and usage in that Oklahoma City Thunder roster. So that's really where Al Horford stands out to me. We can't hit this power forward position without talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo, though. He is the best per minute fantasy producer in the league. He's also one of the most expensive players on the slate. The one issue I have, though, is there are a decent amount of options I like at the power forward position. And also, I just prioritize somebody like Luka Doncic way above Giannis. So how much exposure or how strong of a play do you think Giannis is relative to this slate as a whole?
Yeah, I think he's not quite as good as Luka because of the minutes discrepancy. That being said, new coach, like I don't know exactly what the minutes will be, but if it's close to his season average of 30 last year, that isn't the most exciting thing. The matchup versus Boston is probably a negative as well. So he's a guy that I think is a good play, but compared to Luka, who's kind of like a smash lock, Giannis kind of pales in comparison.
Yeah, and that's really where I'm at. And that's also something, I mean, at the top of the show, we talked about the difference between something like a 13-game slate and a 2-game slate. And we go from having, just a handful of expensive options to now we have everybody on the slate. And you can't really roster all of them. So at a certain point, you have to make considerations as to which guys you're going to prioritize. And I don't think I'm going to get, say, like no exposure to Giannis, but I look at him right now at just under 30% projected ownership on DraftKings. And I'm probably going to be under that number because I'm going to be overweight to Luka Doncic. And that's kind of what happens on these big slates is you're picking and choosing which guys you want to get to. And it's going to be Giannis, not necessarily a priority for me. Any other power forwards that to you think make for good plays worth talking about?
I think we hit on the big ones. My favorites are Horford and Markkanen.
All right, nice. We're on the same guys. So nice. hopefully those are the guys, because there are two players who have a little bit of a wash feeling to them, but rate out so highly for me that I can't really get away from them. Moving over to center now, the first guy who stands out to me, and somebody also who I think that we're really going to need your take on him because you're wearing a jersey of his, is Andre Drummond. No Kevin Love tonight, or Kevin Love not expected to play. So with that in mind, Andre Drummond, who at times last year struggled a little bit from a fantasy perspective for the Cavaliers, but the situation is not the same because the main reason for his varying minutes last year was because Tristan Thompson often closed games. There was kind of a timeshare between him and Thompson, but Thompson isn't on the team anymore. So I don't have nearly the same concerns about the playing time for Drummond as I did with him a year ago. The price is also a little cheaper than we've seen. And then also the rebounding opportunity there, if there's going to be no Kevin Love, is pretty substantial. So Andre Drummond is a guy who I think at center is underpriced and has a very good combination of ceiling and floor.
Definitely. I'm glad I'm not the only stand for Andre Drummond here.
I wouldn't go that far, but he's a good DFS play.
Okay. So what I'm looking at here, the fit with Kevin Love isn't great, I'll be honest, but he's not playing tonight. So you got to expect that Andre Drummond will continue being one of the top rebounders in the league as long as Love is out. He also gets a good amount of assists nowadays. Like last season, he averaged 13% assist percentage. In the preseason, it was even higher. And the usage is good. He was 25% last year, 26% in the preseason. So really all the factors are pointing he should be like a 9K player, and he's 8K. So I think there's a big advantage to there.
Yeah, and I think that what the pricing algorithm is really weighing is inconsistent minutes towards the end of last year. But like I said, that's just not a concern anymore now that Tristan Thompson isn't there. I think that we could really expect Andre Drummond to pretty safely play over 30 minutes, and just not something we have to concern ourselves with as we did a year ago. Other center options, at least on the value side, another guy from the Chicago Bulls, always a little dicey when I'm really interested in Chicago Bulls players, but Wendell Carter Jr. is only 4,400. And he's another guy who, like Lauri Markkanen, was once a really well-regarded young player. And the issue with Wendell Carter has never actually been his on-court performance. It's been that he isn't on the court enough. He gets injured a ton. We saw him, I think, a couple of sprained ankles last year. But 4,400 for a guy who produces about a fantasy point per minute. And I think that if we're going to see him play, 28 to 30 minutes, he's just a little bit underpriced. So Wendell Carter, I wasn't able to talk you off of Lauri Markkanen. Could you talk me off of Wendell Carter Jr.?
I like Wendell Carter. I think last year he averaged 29 minutes a game. There's no real new guys that that are going to challenge him for minutes. His biggest challenge has been himself. He just fouls a lot. He averaged 3.8 fouls per game last year. So that just kind of indicates the average minutes is going to be is significantly lower than the ceiling minutes. And I think that at 4,400, I mean, they just underpriced him pretty significantly. So he looks like the best option at center. I have to agree.
And then one other guy, just because we kind of briefly glanced on him before, and that's DeMarcus Cousins. What do we make of his role? And let's talk about him in the lens of, because right now I don't think he's all that interesting of a play, but what would you make of him if James Harden was to be out? And let's say there's a starting front court of Christian Wood. I almost called him James Wood. Christian Wood next to DeMarcus Cousins. If that is the starting front court for the Rockets without James Harden in, would that make him a potential contrarian option for you?
Yeah, if he's starting, for sure. I think Cousins would be he's not super cheap, but a great fantasy producer, so I think that'd be interesting. I have no idea what the starting lineup would be if Harden misses, and I don't want to speculate about who else was at this club. But yeah, I think Cousins is interesting. One situation I'm intrigued by is the Pistons. They signed Mason Plumlee in the offseason for big bucks. And it's kind of weird because I feel like he's an old school center, kind of like a Horford that's not as good. So he's 3,700 on DraftKings, and he's probably going to be the starting center. He's backed up by Jahlil Okafor. So I think he's if he plays 28 to 30 minutes, he's going to absolutely smash 3,700. But I'm also interested in Blake Griffin. I don't know how the rotations are going to shake out here. But the problem with Blake Griffin is his health. But you get him at the start of the season at his healthiest. He's also center eligible. Talking about prior salaries, he's 7,200. And I feel like his numbers in Detroit were hurt a lot because he was playing with Drummond, who took a lot of rebounds. Mason Plumlee is not nearly as good a rebounder, so I feel like Griffin's numbers are going to spike. So what do you think of Blake Griffin here?
Yeah, I didn't really get to him a ton in the initial build I did. So it's hard for me to say that he's a high priority for me as of now, just because if I didn't roster a ton of him, I can't go out and say yeah, he looks great. I understand the logic for him, and at 7,200, that is a little cheaper than he's historically been. But even so, I'm just a little wary of the minutes because the Pistons, I don't really understand what the fit is for Blake Griffin on that team long term. I think that ideally they would like to trade him at some point. So I think players like Derrick Rose and Blake Griffin, it's hard for me to project them to play a ton of minutes to open the season just because I think ideally they'd like to keep them healthy, have them play relatively well on the court, and then move on from them and really have the team built around guys and this sounds dumb, but I mean, Jeremy Grant and Killian Hayes, and then even Mason Plumlee to an extent because they gave him so much money. I think that this is a team that built a very awkward team in the offseason, and they made big investments in Mason Plumlee and Jeremy Grant for long-term contracts too. So this team, for better or worse, seems to be saying hey, we're building around Jeremy Grant and Mason Plumlee for now.
Definitely. Yeah. The thing is, Griffin's value for a trade is at an all-time low. So he's got a player option next year for $38 million. So I feel like they're going to have to prove to everyone beyond any doubt that he'd be worth it. So I think there's potential there. I think tonight will tell us a lot about how this Pistons rotation is going to go.
Yeah, and I think we're going to learn a lot about a lot of these teams. And I think there's a lot of players after tonight's slate that we're going to feel dumb for projecting highly. There's going to be a lot of players we feel dumb for projecting lowly because we'll look back on and be oh, of course we should have known this guy was going to play 30 minutes. There'll be another guy who's like Eric Pascal, where we'll be oh my God, I can't believe we thought this guy was going to be a great value play. And then we'll find out a little bit more as we go on. But that is going to wrap up the show. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't done it yet, hit that like button, give us the thumbs up, and subscribe to the YouTube channel so that Alex will continue to be friends with me. Follow us on Twitter at Awesemo_com and at Awesemo NBA, and plenty of other shows coming up on the YouTube channel. All the more reason to subscribe so you know when these are going to go live. We have the NFL strategy shows for the Sunday slate, for the Saturday slate, NBA Deeper Dive, and NBA Live Before Lock also coming up tonight. So that's going to do it for us. Jordan, play the Christmas music out.